Andrew Myers, a quiet elderly man with a calm and unassuming presence, stepped into a bustling car dealership one chilly afternoon. His old sedan, though reliable, was nearing a decade old, and he had decided it was finally time for an upgrade. Dressed in a worn-out coat and scuffed shoes, Andrew looked completely out of place among the sleek, polished interiors and the well-dressed clientele. Yet, he wasn't there to impress anyone. He was simply looking for a car that would suit his needs. As Andrew wandered through the dealership, admiring the shiny vehicles on display, the reaction from the staff couldn't have been more dismissive. Despite his clear interest in purchasing, no one made an effort to offer him assistance. Instead, the salespeople busied themselves with younger, more flashy customers, those who appeared to have the means to afford the luxury models on display. Andrew's modest appearance seemed to make him invisible, like an unwelcome shadow in the showroom. One salesman, Garrett Blake, a young man with slicked-back hair and a self-assured smirk, made brief eye contact with Andrew. But just as quickly, he shifted his attention to a well-dressed couple who had entered moments earlier. The staff's whispers, their dismissive glances, and the clear indifference were impossible for Andrew to ignore. Undeterred, Andrew patiently stood by a shiny black sedan that had caught his attention, running his hand over its sleek, polished surface. He imagined himself behind the wheel, the car's smooth ride offering him the comfort and reliability he was looking for. After nearly 20 minutes of being completely ignored, Andrew's patience began to wear thin. Determined to take control of the situation, he walked over to the main desk, where three salesmen were deep in conversation. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm and steady despite the rising frustration within him. "I'm interested in purchasing one of your vehicles. Could someone assist me?" Garrett, barely glancing up from his phone, gave a dismissive wave. "We're a bit busy right now," he replied, without missing a beat. "Why don't you come back later?" Andrew's expression remained neutral, though inside, his disappointment and anger began to simmer. He nodded politely and turned to leave, his heart weighed down with the sting of rejection. As he walked out, he overheard one of the salesmen muttering under his breath, followed by a faint chuckle. "Wasting time on window shoppers," the voice sneered. What they didn't know, however, was that Andrew Myers was no ordinary man. For decades, he had built a fortune through shrewd investments and sharp business acumen. Yet, despite his wealth, he chose to live simply, prioritizing character and integrity over material possessions. That day, the humiliation he felt wouldn't be easily forgotten. And as he drove away in his old car, a plan began to form in his mind. Later that evening, Andrew placed a few phone calls to his influential contacts in the business world. By the next morning, he had orchestrated a move that would not only change his life, but would shake the dealership to its core. The following day, Andrew Myers returned to the dealership, not as a customer, but with an entirely different purpose. Through a series of strategic negotiations and calls the night before, he had secured the necessary funds and agreements to acquire the entire dealership. As he stepped through the glass doors, the same staff who had ignored him the day before were present, unaware of the monumental shift that had taken place overnight. Dressed in his modest coat and worn shoes, Andrew appeared unchanged. But this time, there was a glint of determination in his eyes, a spark that signaled his unwavering resolve. The general manager of the dealership, a man who had been among those who overlooked Andrew the day before, was about to experience a very different Andrew Myers than the one they had dismissed earlier. A middle-aged man named Thomas Green noticed Andrew immediately. Unaware of who he was or why he had returned, Thomas forced a smile and approached him. "Good morning, sir," Thomas said, his tone polite, though it lacked sincerity. "How can we assist you today?" Andrew, without a word, reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a neatly folded set of documents. He handed them to Thomas, his eyes never leaving his face, studying his reaction closely. As Thomas unfolded the papers, his brows furrowed. He began to read, and his confident smile slowly faded, replaced by a growing look of disbelief and panic. What is this?" Thomas stammered, his voice shaky. Andrew finally broke the silence, his voice calm and steady. "I'm not here to buy a car," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I'm here as your new boss." The room went silent as Andrew's words sank in. The staff, who had once dismissed Andrew, now watched in stunned silence, their curiosity piqued. Whispers began to spread among them as they tried to piece together what was happening. Thomas, still holding the papers with trembling hands, looked up at Andrew with wide, disbelieving eyes. This can't be right," he muttered. Andrew's expression remained firm, unshaken. "That's correct," he replied. "As of this morning, I own this dealership, and I'm here to make some changes." The staff exchanged uneasy glances. Those who had mocked Andrew the day before now shifted uncomfortably in their spots. Garrett Blake, the slick-haired salesman who had dismissed Andrew so callously, looked uneasy, his usual smirk replaced by a look of dread. Andrew turned to address the entire room. His voice, though measured, carried a quiet authority that made everyone stop in their tracks. "Yesterday," he began, "I came here as a customer, looking to buy a car. But instead of being treated with respect, I was ignored, dismissed, and judged based on my appearance. You assumed I wasn't worth your time. You made a mistake." The tension in the room was thick, and no one dared to interrupt. Andrew continued, his tone growing more resolute. "As of today, things are going to change," he declared. "This dealership will no longer tolerate arrogance or discrimination of any kind. Every customer who walks through those doors will be treated with respect, regardless of how they look or what you think they can afford." He turned back to Thomas, locking eyes with him. "And that starts with leadership. Thomas, you're fired." Thomas's jaw dropped. Fired," he echoed, incredulity in his voice. "You can't be serious." "I'm very serious," Andrew replied, his voice unwavering. "Your leadership has fostered a toxic culture here. And that ends now." The silence that followed was deafening. One by one, Andrew began addressing the other staff members, calling out those who had exhibited the same dismissive attitude he had faced the day before. Garrett was among the first names on the list. "Garrett Blake," Andrew said, his eyes locking onto the young salesman. Garrett froze, unable to meet Andrew's gaze. "You showed me exactly the kind of attitude this dealership will no longer tolerate," Andrew continued. "Pack your things." Garrett opened his mouth, likely to protest, but no words came out. He knew there was no point in arguing. With his head down, he walked slowly toward the back office to gather his belongings. As Garrett shuffled away, Andrew's eyes continued scanning the room, his appraisal of the staff far from over. Those who had sneered, whispered, or treated him with disdain the day before were either dismissed or warned, as Andrew began to reshape the environment of the dealership. The changes had only just begun, and the staff would soon realize the magnitude of their mistake in underestimating him. The remaining staff, now visibly shaken, began to understand that Andrew wasn't merely firing people out of a sense of revenge. No, he was building something more profound, a team that would reflect the values he held dear: respect, humility, and kindness. Among the group, one employee stood out, a young woman named Laura Bennett. Unlike her colleagues, Laura had discreetly greeted Andrew the previous day, offering him a warm smile. She wasn't assigned to sales, but Andrew remembered that small act of kindness and saw potential in her. "Laura Bennett," Andrew called out. She stepped forward nervously, unsure of what was coming. "You're one of the few people here who treated me with even a shred of decency," Andrew said, his voice steady. "Starting today, you'll be the new floor manager. I trust you'll lead with fairness and respect." Laura's eyes widened in surprise. "Me? But I've only been here 6 months," she stammered. "I'm not interested in seniority," Andrew replied calmly. "I'm interested in people who treat others the right way." "Congratulations, Laura." The room was now filled with unease. The remaining staff, visibly shaken, began to realize that Andrew wasn't there just to punish people. He was there to rebuild. He addressed the room once more, his voice calm but resolute. "This dealership will no longer operate as it has in the past," he declared. "I want each of you to understand that every customer matters. Whether they're dressed in a 3-piece suit or an old coat like mine, they deserve your full attention and respect. If you can't uphold those values, there's no place for you here. By the end of the day, nearly half of the staff had been dismissed. Those who remained were given clear instructions on how the dealership would operate moving forward. Andrew wasted no time hiring replacements, prioritizing individuals who shared his vision for a respectful and inclusive workplace. The transformation was swift. Word spread quickly about the dramatic change in ownership, and customers began to notice the difference almost immediately. Where arrogance and indifference had once prevailed, a welcoming and professional atmosphere now flourished. Within weeks, sales soared, and the dealership's reputation skyrocketed. People came from all over the city, not just to buy cars, but to experience the exceptional service that had become the dealership's hallmark. Andrew, however, remained as modest as ever. He didn't bask in the attention or take credit for the turnaround. For him, it wasn't about proving a point to the staff who had dismissed him. It was about creating something meaningful, a place where people felt valued. One afternoon, as Andrew walked through the showroom now bustling with activity, Laura approached him. "Mr. Myers," she began hesitantly, "I just wanted to thank you for believing in me and giving me this opportunity." Andrew smiled warmly. "You earned it, Laura. All I did was recognize what was already there. Just remember to keep treating people the way you always have, with respect. That's what truly matters." Laura nodded, her confidence growing with each passing day. Under her leadership and Andrew's guidance, the dealership continued to flourish. As Andrew prepared to leave the showroom, he took one last look around. The same space that had once been filled with indifference and condescension was now alive with positivity and purpose. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not from the power he now held, but from the change he had fostered. This experience reminded him that true wealth wasn't about money or possessions. It was about how you treated others and the lasting impact you made on the world. Andrew Myers had proven that humility and kindness could triumph over arrogance, and in doing so, he left an indelible mark, not just on the dealership, but on everyone who crossed its doors.